Museum, and I work with Stacy Hawkins and Katie Rice, who are here with me tonight at the museum, and as well as Catherine Broad, who goes by Kate, and Alexia Martinez, and Sue Allen is on staff, and we have a wonderful group of 20 folks who also serve on our advisory board, who are a combination of people from the community, from the business community, and who are also involved as part of MNPC PPC. So it's just wonderful to continue to grow the family of people who support the work we do here at Marietta House Museum. And today we are marking 2021 Earth Day. So happy Earth Day to you and welcome to Marietta House Museum. Tonight's program is designed to provide a historical perspective on 19th century natural resources sought for human health and nutrition. Before we get started with the program, I'm thrilled to be able to let you know that the Farmers Market at Marietta will begin on Saturday, May 1st, and it goes from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Also, May 13th, Marietta will present an online talk called Hollywood Cinema Representations of Slave Cabins. The talk will explore how slave dwellings were depicted in Hollywood films during the 20th century and how recollections of slave life were reflected in the media, followed by a presentation by public archaeologist Stephanie Sperling, who's done digs at Mount Calvert to locate the slave quarters. One more announcement, Marietta will help host the annual Echoes of the Enslaved program on September 11th and 12th, and it will be held in person and online. It will be a hybrid program with Joe McGill of the Slave Dwelling Project. So those are just a few of the things to look forward to coming our way. So if you'd like to type in the chat during the program, please feel free. And at the end, I'm sure that our speakers will be happy to take your questions, and we'll have an opportunity to speak with both Trenda and Stacy. If you'd like to receive a copy of Marietta House Museum's free monthly newsletter, just also if you'd like to type in the chat to include you on that mailing list, we'd be happy to do that. It's packed with articles and calendars, kids pages, and local history news. And with that, Marietta House Museum acknowledges the history and continued traditions of the Piscataway Canoe tribe, who hunted, farmed, and lived on this land long before Marietta House was built. As we consider the history of this place, take a moment to remember the many people who were forced to leave their traditional homelands. Now I'll introduce tonight's speakers, Stacy Hawkins and Trenda Bird Davidson. Stacy Hawkins is the program coordinator for Marietta House Museum, a facility of Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. Stacy was previously the site administrator for 2 historic homes with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Woodlawn Historic Site, and Frank Lloyd Wright's Pope Leahy House. Stacy's museum experience also includes Monticello, James Madison's Montpelier, and Gunston Hall. She's currently on the board of the Prince George's County Historical Society, a member of the Historic House Museum Consortium, the Prince George's Historic House Consortium, and the Virginia Association of Museums. Originally from Hickory, North Carolina, Trenda Bird Davidson earned her undergraduate degrees from Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, in history and public history. She received a Master of Arts degree from Morgan State University in Museum Studies and Historical Preservation with a focus in education. Ms. Bird Davidson has worked at several museums, including Banneker Douglas, the Tubman Museum, and Historic Rattonsville. Her expertise is in African American history from chattel slavery to the 1960s civil rights movement. Mrs. Bird Davidson is the founder and CEO of Bird Owl Consulting, providing services to schools and museums on how to effectively teach African American history. She is also the host of a podcast called Bird's Eye View, which looks at what's happening in Black America today. Trenda is the assistant director at the College Park Aviation Museum, which is part of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. She's a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the American Association of African American Museums, and is a certified interpretive guide through the National Association of Interpreters. So we're in for a real treat to hear from these two experts who are joining us today on Earth Day. Thank you so much. Stacy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. And it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to do a program with you, Trenda. So this will be a fun evening. And thank you all again for joining us. And as Julie said, happy Earth Day to everyone. Now, as we start this evening, what we're focusing on today is we're focusing on foodways and herbs, and also the use of the earth and how important it was to the African American culture.
Just share your screen.
Oh.
And go back to Teams.
Okay.
And then the PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay, everyone, just had to reset, share my screen for you so that you could see what I was talking about here. So it was very important to the African American culture. Everything was put to use and there was no waste. It seemed that everything had a purpose. To start with, I want to give you an idea what the grounds looked like, and using a bit of imagination, of course. So this is Marietta House. Marietta was the home to Gabriel Duvall, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. And the home was built around 1813, but Gabriel Duvall and his second wife did not move into the home until about 1816. Gabriel's first wife had died in childbirth. And so Gabriel was here until about 1844, and then his descendants lived in the home until 1902. Marietta was also the home to Tom and Sarah Butler and their family. They were enslaved here on the property and brought here from Washington, D.C. Maria was the enslaved cook to Gabriel's family for over 20 years until her death in 1836. Serena was the mother of 3 children who also served in the kitchen. Rachel was a young girl of 8 years old when she took care of Gabriel Duvall's young granddaughter, Gabriella. Later, Rachel had a baby girl named Emily, and Rachel was later replaced, most likely by Martha, to take over the care of Gabriella. Martha was the daughter of Amelia and Jacob, all enslaved here on the property. And I tell you about them because we will hear about them a little bit later on. Over here to the,
You can use your arrow keys on your keyboard.
okay. Okay, I did want to show you with my arrow here. This is the root cellar here for you to see, and then this is the law office. The law office, interestingly, was built 2 years before the house itself. The law office built in 1811. This area here that I'm showing you is actually where the stables, the carriage house, and the barns were here on the property. And over here to the left, this joins along Bell Station Road. Bell Station Road is now a historic road, but was actually an inner farm road during Gabriel's time here. And this road went on down towards where Lanham Severn Road is today, Lanham Severn and Seabrook, as we know it today. The road that's over here on the other side, our 193, this actually was just, again, another little gravel road that went kind of through the farmlands over here to Lanham Severn Road, which would take you over to Bowie. And this little building here, this is a smokehouse. It was moved here in about early 2000. It's actually a period smokehouse that was moved from another farm in Fort Washington. And this marks the area where the outbuildings were. There were 26 outbuildings here on the property at Marietta. And here you can see a map of those outbuildings. The number 8 that you see up here was an enslaved workers duplex cabin. And this was taken down in 1941 when the home was with private owners. And I also, here's where I want to show you again how the earth was used. We have the enslaved workers cabin made from wood. We have the spring house here, the dairy, the ice house, chicken coop, and then the soap making. The soap was a lye that was made from the ashes of the fires. So again, using everything that they could. And we don't actually have something that says that there were beehives here at Marietta, but some of the neighboring plantations did have beehives for honey and for the beeswax for candles. There were orchards here at Marietta as well. We found peach pits in our archaeology in the kitchen area, and there were peach trees, pear trees, and apple orchards as well. These are the bricks made from local clay here in the area. And this is a mark of the 2 fingerprints here that you can see. The stone workers here put in their mark into the brick as they're molding it for the house. And when you come to visit us, you'll actually see a number of bricks that still have the handprints in them. This is the kitchen area of Marietta, and I show you these 2 corners here. They're in the light, they're near the fireplace, and we did find a number of sewing items in this area as well to show you, what a busy place it was here, lots going on. This is the staircase here that you see that Rachel and Maria and Serena would have been using. This goes from the kitchen area to the main block of the house. And so when you come to visit us, you will be able to walk in their footsteps coming up these stairs. And the kitchen area, again, to show you there was so much going on here. We found sewing items, there was ironing, washing dishes, preparing meals, and a bit of childcare going on as well. Some of the enslaved workers looking after the smaller children as they went about their chores. This was a button that we found made from wood. Found in one of the corner kitchen areas here, again using the earth, and then the thimbles, metals from the earth, and a safety pin here to the left, and then to the right, a little peg button made out of plastic or glass, each of it, again, materials from the earth. And then for the clothing as well, cotton from the cotton plant would have been used for the heavy cotton dress weave, finer one for the muslin, and then for the gingham, wool from the sheep, and then the flax plant used for the linen. All of this would have been spun and made into clothing. This is our root cellar, and here you can see the inside of the root cellar, which we hope to have on tour for you a little bit later on. But as you look in here, this is where canning was done. The fruits and vegetables would have been stored here. And where you see above in the rafters, the herbs would have been hung in little sheaths from the top of those rungs. And then there were also herb gardens here, a number of herb gardens, and there would have been African-American herb gardens here as well, because they would have needed these gardens to supplement the meager portions that they received for their food. Early African-American gardens often included rosemary, mint, catnip, pennyroyal, sage, and balm, and depending on location, also basil. Herbs are known for their medicinal, culinary, or aromatic value, and in many enslaved African-American communities, an herb could also include parts of trees and common weeds. In some areas, herbs were used to disinfect and sweeten gourds and earthenware pots, prevent infection in wounds, or purify the body, and in initiation or religious ceremonies. Herbs were used to expel insects, and others were used for amulets and charms. And many familiar herbs from the African culture were found here along with some of the new exotic plants. Without the use of herbs, the foodways of the enslaved would have been much blander, and their spiritual traditions would have lacked a major component. Herbs also provided a sense of humanity despite the utter poverty that the enslaved had to endure. Herbs were used as a medicine and also for food flavorings and decoration. Both men and women had access to and participated in herbalism in enslaved communities, but for women, the use and value of herbs was especially important in matters of healing, beginning with childbirth and continuing through child care and child rearing, and pretty much family health care as well. According to Michael Twitty, enslaved women were particularly valued for their role as midwives and healers of childhood illnesses and women's trouble. Midwives and doctors were essential persons of the social landscape, drawing their personal and communal power from the herbs that they grew and gathered around them. And here we have a list of some of the most common plants that were used. You can see all of the different things that they were used for. Again, a cotton plant used to help ease the pains of childbirth, tansy used for the fever and swelling, and the snake root seemed to be the most popular from the 17th century through to the 20th century. And the different herbs that you see here, thyme used as a disinfectant and a healing ingredient, and basil used for both spiritual and food purification. The sage and mint that you see here was used as a deodorant. They would actually take the mint leaves, put them in the mortar and pestle, and then create like a paste and put it on their arms. And they would take the leaves of the mint and sage and put it between the clothing so that it would smell good. You can see the sweet potato plant was used as a cure for malaria. And so because it was deemed to be so effective, it was actually cultivated for both food and for curing malaria. Persimmons and sassafras, good for getting rid of the worms in the body, could also be used as a sweetener. And again, speaking of the worms, I'll show you this over here, garlic used to help rid the body of parasitic worms from unsanitary conditions. And especially the children were given all kinds of chores, which, put them in some very unsanitary conditions. They were cleaning the chamber pot, sweeping, taking out ashes from the fireplace, digging for gardening. Their form of doing a compost with the animal waste, and they were picking up the little cow patties or cow dung for the heat to heat their homes. And so the little ones are out there doing all that, not very easy for them to be able to wash their hands, and they're eating, putting their face to their eyes. And so it was very important for them to be able to have this to help them. Lavender that you can see up here, lavender was used for a number of things. Here we have a lavender farm, lavender very important today as well. It was used for relaxation and to help to sleep, also to keep away the flies and bugs. And when the lavender was used for the bugs, what would happen is it would either be put on the food item itself, or it would be tied in like a little sheath again and hung in the window, and then the food items would be put underneath the sheaves there to keep that away. The rosemary, lavender, and roses were used as a means of deodorizing and perfuming special clothing, and were especially important in special ceremony and in charms. Now, from Gabriel Duval's journals, he too was using some of the natural things. You can see here for rheumatism, he has apply a cabbage leaf to the part affected, and it has to be a good sized leaf apparently, and it will produce a local perspiration and effect a cure. This is from his journals and advice that he collected from readings and from friends. In the cure for cholera, again, you can see here a spoonful of lavender and peppermint. And we also have a list of medicines from the cabinet of Charles Carroll of Homewood. And there are a number of items here that would have been purchased from the apothecary, but some of the items listed are natural herbs. So you can see a list of those herbs as well. And when you're looking at that, I will point out that when you see the gum mira, this was actually used for soreness and swelling of the gums, inflamed gums, and used for chapped lips. And it was from a small thorny tree and came from Africa and is found on the Arabian Peninsula. The same with the gum kino. This was actually from a species of the eucalyptus tree. This was found in West Africa, and it was used as a medicine for the intestines, and it was supposed to settle the intestines, and was also used as a gargle and for sore throats. Now, as far as the food is concerned, European settlers favored lovage, parsley, sage, thyme, borage, and horseradish. So that was what was in most of the gardens here in the Maryland area. There were food items that eventually made their way here to Maryland through the slave trade ship captains, which included ground nuts, okra, palm oil, and rice. Okra was believed to have made its way from the Caribbean up to Pennsylvania by 1748. According to Maryland food historian Michael Twitty, in his work, The Foodways of Enslaved Afro-Marylanders, he said okra plays a definite part in Maryland food traditions. While only about 10% of enslaved people coming to Maryland came from the Caribbean, it is likely that many of the Africanisms we perceive to have been brought directly from Africa to the Chesapeake were introduced from the enslaved communities of Barbados and Antigua. He says that the Afro-Caribbean cooks who worked in the kitchens as cooks of the white ruling class were able to incorporate their tastes into the dishes prepared for those white people. And so he said many early white Marylanders had a taste for Black New World cooking. And there was a mix with some of the African American food, the Native American food, and the European food. And so over a period of time, you can see all of these different foods being introduced in different ways into the diet. Now, I wanted to show you this, the okra. The okra is very important. You can see here to the left, the okra bean itself, and this was coarse cut. You could use, you could have fried okra with this. You could also use the seeds. Now, the seeds from the pods were roasted, and they were used as a substitute for coffee. So I will point out that it was caffeine free. So if anyone is trying to kick the coffee habit, you can try some roasting some of the okra seeds and see what you think. The root that is here was actually, it's cut, when you cut this on the inside, there is a gooey substance. And so when you cook it, the substance is released and that would thicken the broth and it would create a thicker soup to help the food go, feed many more people in the families. It's also a substance used in gumbo as well. And when you look at this, you can see that with the pods, they also would take this leaf, they would chop it up, and they would use it as a paste for infections and cuts. And okra was often given to women who were in labor to help the birthing process. Now, as we're talking about the foods here, there was from the slave narratives, a man named Dennis Sims, an enslaved man in a neighboring plantation. He gives a list of his rations, stating it was bread, hominy, blackstrap molasses, and red herring a day. And with special permission, they would be able to go hunting, catch a coon or possum, and then have a pot pie. And when they were catching a lot of these animals, they were catching them in traps and then killing them with sticks and rocks. And here again, using what was available, you can see that he had oxhide shoes. Resin Williams, an enslaved man here from the Bowie area, says that they seldom got chicken and mostly ate red herring and again the molasses. And he said he preferred the possums to rabbits, liked fish best, and his favorite food was corn pone and fried liver. And we'll hear about corn pone a little bit later. And again, his mother used to make beer out of persimmons and corn husks. Now, I wanted to show you this again, findings in our archaeological digs of the foodstuffs here. And so you can take a look at this, see what you think. This is the skeleton and could very well be a possum. I wanted to show you a picture here where you can see the teeth of the possum and kind of the shape of the nose, so you can decide if you think that that is a possum. And then over here, this was also bones that were found in the same area, bones from swine or oxen or cow. Now, additional foods that could be found in the woods, you can see here where the fruits and berries and greens, turnips and cabbage were sometimes available. And then the coarsely ground corn that was given to many of the enslaved workers, they would use some of it for corn pone, which was a small loaf of cornmeal made without milk or eggs, and it was often fried. And when it was fried, it was actually fried on the hearth of the fireplace, and the hoe cake was made specifically to be fried on the hoe in the field. It was just made with water and a little bit of salt, and you could literally, you could have a fire in the field while you're working, put the hoe there, and it would fit on the hoe, and so they could have their hoe cake. And then the ash cake was a mixture of cornmeal and water, and they would wrap it in cabbage leaves and then cook the cabbage leaves in the ashes in an open hearth, or it could also be baked on some very hot sand. And crackling bread was a cornbread made with the fried pork fat that was known as crackling. Sometimes part of their rations did include a bit of the fried pork fat. Now, though some of their familiar foods were here in Maryland, the enslaved population had to adapt how they ate and what they ate, depending upon location and availability of certain foods. They learned to prepare foods like corn, collards, deer, possum, and potatoes. Much archaeological evidence indicates that bowls and cups were used, suggesting that the preference was for soups and stews. And many small animal bones also supports this suggestion. And again, we saw the small bones there of the animal. Plantation diets varied greatly according to what was available and the season. How much they needed to supplement depended on what the enslaving family would supply. Most enslaved workers were allotted a small portion of meal, and in our area, usually cornmeal, molasses, and low cuts of pork. The work routines may or may not have left time to cultivate the gardens, allow time to hunt or fish. Weather conditions would also be a consideration. And if rivers or lakes were nearby, they could have catfish, bass, carp, and perch. In our region, wild game such as deer, squirrel, rabbit, Turkey and other fowl were available, and also chickens were often raised and sold, which meant that eggs could be added to the diet. And we did find eggshells here in the kitchen area, which may also suggest, again, that some sort of composting was taking place as well. Providing their own gardens would allow the enslaved workers to have vegetables, and some were also allowed to raise livestock such as pigs, sheep, and cows. They also would find pine nuts, wild berries, and greens. And the gardens that they had were usually like a community garden. If someone had chicken or eggs, they may trade them for tomatoes or corn from another's garden. Many of the enslaved workers did not usually work on Sundays or holidays, and so they could spend time in adding to their food supply. And some of the foods introduced into the African American diet were corn, sweet potatoes, beans, and tomatoes. There was also the selling of wares at the market on Sunday, which often included fowl, egg, honey, berries, melons, and other goods. They would make wooden stools, ceramic pots, or sweetgrass. Oh, yeah, no, I'm not ready.
Oh, okay.
Thank
Just
you.
making sure.
So now I want to compare that to this, which is the gentry household. So this is what is on the gentry household table here. So you can see quite a difference in how they're eating. So here are they're eating all of the different meats here that you see, stuffed cabbages, vegetables with sauces. They have desserts, sweet pies, candies, and then wine, ale, port, or sherry. And then you can see a list here of all of the special ingredients that would have been kept under lock and key and given out when it was time. This would be doled out to the cooks when they were ready to prepare a meal. The cook in the household would have been a very important position. This was usually someone trained from the mistress of the household, and usually in the style of European cooking, or it would have been someone who was apprenticed to another Black cook. Men and women were cooks, and choosing a good apprentice for the kitchen would have involved a child. The child would carry firewood, haul ashes, rotate a spit, take out the garbage, and other chores. And if the child showed interest and was really focused on it, he or she would be given more jobs, such as kneading bread, chopping vegetables, and stirring pots. And good characteristics were the ability to be neat and precise. Cooks were also responsible for pounding and grating the sugar in large solid cones, plucking and preparing the poultry, and understanding all of these balanced menus of dishes. There's a book, Robert Roberts. He was an enslaved cook in 1827, and he writes that whenever there were parties, they hardly had any sleep at all because they were so busy cleaning up from the night before. It would be in the early morning hours, and then they would have to get up just a couple hours later to prepare breakfast. Water would be hauled from wells, firewood had to be cut and stacked, poultry and livestock all had to be butchered and salted. And the plantation gardens would have to be picked for the vegetables. And with all that, the cook's rations would be the same as the others, cornmeal, salt, and pork, and then they too would add on to their supplements. And then this is the original kitchen here, again, where Maria and Serena worked. And so this is all of the work that they would have been doing here. This would have been quite a busy place. And I wanted to show you this as well. This is the last as I wrap up here. But corn was such a very important part of the diet and very important here in Maryland. Corn was for eating, for feeding the animals. When the stalks were taken off, when the corn was taken off the stalks would have been wet and they would have been braided while they were wet, and they would have made sleeping mats, baskets, brooms, even moccasins, and then here perhaps a doll for one of the children. And corn silk was used for medicine and safflower oil, and even today corn is a huge new energy, so to speak. They have health pills made from it. Corn is the main source of ethanol fuel because it's biodegradable. And so they're trying to actually incorporate it into plastics so that they don't have the full plastic like we have today. They're trying to put the corn into it so they can wean themselves off of the plastics that aren't biodegradable and that are really destroying our oceans and our land. And so with that, again, I know Julie mentioned our farmers market. I'd like to point out our farmers market starting. And I would also like to show you, for those of you interested in foodways, these are a number of the books that I used. And this last book, Rufus Estes was an enslaved man who became a cook. He later became a chef, and then was on the Pullman was a Pullman cook on the Pullman Railroad. And I mention that because we have our exhibit that will be opening when we open our house. And you can come and visit our it's the Pullman Porters and Civil Rights exhibit, and that will be Tuesdays and Wednesdays for the exhibit, and then Thursdays and Fridays the exhibit will be included in the tour. So we hope you come to see us, and I thank you very much.
We have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Was there any evidence of where some of the herbs like lavender would have been planted? Is there any plants that are still there? Or like, for example, the landscape, was there any evidence of a specific garden, like irrigation wall areas, or were there community gardens?
That is a great question. We don't actually have any physical evidence of that because there was quite a bit in the 1922, when the house was sold away from the family. There were different farmers that were here. It was they were sharecroppers who were here, and so they initially were plowing up quite a bit of our field here and had taken down a number of the buildings. But the thought is that kind of here to the left of our house, and if I go back real fast here, this area here to the left this is kind of the only evidence we have here is from this map that was taken from a remembrance of one of the great-granddaughters that was growing up here in the 1850s and 1860s. And so she writes her recollection of what she remembers here at Marietta. So the garden would have been here, this large area here to the left of the house, which would have been, let's see, right before this area here. So all of this area, before you get to the start of the outbuildings, this is where the garden most likely would have been.
There's one more question.
Sure.
You mentioned coffee. Was it similar to the coffee today with milk and sugar, or just black coffee? Or what was the most popular drink of those times?
That's a great question. There were actually two popular drinks, coffee and tea. And Thomas Jefferson had said that coffee was the drink of the civilized world. And coffee was taken pretty much black at that time because cream and sugar was kind of a very expensive commodity. And so coffee was pretty much taken black, but they also had, what we have with our espresso today. The coffee sometimes could be very, very strong. And of course, as you know, they also had the chocolate too, which was the bitter chocolate. And so the coffee sometimes could be quite rough, almost like an espresso today. And then, of course, the tea came. The tea mostly during the Revolutionary War, when it was harder to get coffee imported, and so they had the tea. And then again, I'm sorry, I take that back. After the tea, because the tea was imported, then coffee became popular again. So they kind of went back and forth between the coffee and the tea. But yeah, from many of the things that I read, the coffee was pretty much served just straight.
Stacy.
Yes.
Oh, this is Catherine. So
Hey.
I had two questions. Can you remind us when digs were done at Marietta? And also, are there any more personal or specific artifacts known to have been or assessed to have been as things that were used by the enslaved peoples, specifically like personally, like personal items or personal effects?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I have to say that we're so pleased, I guess, and excited to be able to go through a number of these items. We have all made trips over to our archaeological building, which is over on the other side of the county. But these were digs that were done in 1970, and then later in 1980, and then as late as 1995, there were some digs being done here. And so we've been going through those. The thing about it is that there was so much construction that was going on here that there's different levels of where these different pieces were. And so they could have been earlier pieces, but through the digging, they kind of got on the top level of where the digs were. There's different degrees going through the dirt.
That's
And
called the
so
strata. Yeah, the strata.
Thank
Yes.
you. The strata. And so right now, when we're finding things, it gives us a list of where they were found in the strata. But some of the pieces that we find are older than where the strata would have put them. And so it's an ongoing process at the moment. We are finding so many interesting things, and we're through our newsletter and through our Facebook posts, we try to introduce as many of these new items as we find so that we can keep the community engaged and involved. And also, if people have any information or would like to come forward with any information, we would love to have them come and talk to us. And so the things that I showed here were just a few examples, and we are definitely looking for items that would have belonged to the enslaved labor force. We would really like to be able to find something and say, yes, that's what it is. And so that's a continuing work in progress here.
Yeah, thanks. There was, I don't know, I don't remember which issue, but I do recall that in the newsletter, there were some wonderful things that you all had shared and had given some information about the dig. So I thought it would be good to mention that to the visitors tonight. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Catherine. We appreciate it very much. And so we will continue on with Trenda. Trenda, thank you so much. Please take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. I think that was some great information, all the great information that that Stacy had given. I believe that, are we still planning to show the videos or?
Yes, we do have those.
Okay, so basically in the videos, I'd really just talk about how the enslaved kind of used the earth and how back then, even with the enslaved and with the Native Americans, how they were kind of really more reliant on the earth, and how we're not as reliant on earth as they were as today. But it's kind of like a circle of life, kind of like history repeating itself, because now we're trying to get back, almost trying to get back to those roots and being more organic, and just really looking at what we're putting into our bodies, including what kind of things we're putting on our skin as well. So there's going to be a couple of videos where I talk about how the enslaved kind of used the earth, and kind of like even how enslaved culture is tied to the earth, how, you know, black culture today is even tied to the earth, and just like what Mother Earth means to what it meant to the enslaved population. So let's see. So hello, my name is Trinda Davison, and I'm here to talk to you about a little bit about Earth Day, but then also how about the enslaved and how they live and what they use for the earth kind of relates back to Earth Day. A lot of times we think about Earth Day as science and technology and sustainability, but we're going to bring that connection and how it connects to history. Because even today, we are all still connected to the earth, and the people here at Marietta House actually were even more connected as well, because they were actually using things from the earth that we still get today. So things like different herbs, plants that we might use. You might notice that today's society, we're more we're talking about being organic and going to the store and getting more organic foods now. Well, they were being organic as well, but back then they didn't have grocery stores to go to. So as I talk about some of these things, we're going to be taking a look around the Marietta House and looking at different ways that the enslaved actually looked at or celebrated Earth Day without even knowing about it. So what we're going to do is, one of the things I want to talk about first is some of the plants. So some of you guys might have like herb gardens. I know a lot of historical sites might have an herb garden. So some things that you might find in the herb garden would be things like mint, ginger. You might find peppermint, different medicinal herbs that you would use for healing, but also for cooking. Today we might use a lot of the seasonings like basil and oregano. Those all come from plants, and so you can see how we thrive on our plants even to live today, and it helps season our food and give that taste. But I'm going to talk about a little bit more about food and livestock even later. But going back to the plants, so with some of these plants, you can probably walk around your own house, you can walk around the park, and you can find all kind of things that would help even sustain the earth, because we do need plants to help sustain the earth for us to breathe. But you will also see how the enslaved even talked about plants. A lot of some of the old recipes or some of the herbs that you might use for healing that the enslaved might use, people actually use today. One of the things that you might be familiar with is kind of like a gumbo. So one of the plants that I'm talking about, because we also talking about fruits and vegetables, there's also plants where they come from the ground. One of the things is okra. So okra is actually not indigenous to North America. It actually came from the continent of Africa. And so when the Africans were first brought over here to be enslaved, okra is one of those plants that was brought over here. And so now we use okra for a lot of different dishes. The most popular one that people like to think of is either fried okra or gumbo. So the difference between a gumbo and a stew is the okra itself. I'm not a big fan of okra, but I will eat a good gumbo. I can't eat fried okra by itself. So another one of the things that we get from Africa is actually watermelon. A lot of people don't know that watermelon actually comes from the continent of Africa as well. So in summertime, when people are always buying watermelons from the farmers market, that is actually a plant that came from Africa as well. And so that was a plant that people, and a fruit that a lot of people like to enjoy back then, even today. So with the enslaved population, depending on what plantation they were living at, they used different plants for different reasons. I know even today.
Sorry about that. Looks like someone hit the wrong button.
Does a good job of like, if you're feeling nauseated, then they say that get a ginger root and like drink ginger tea or anything like that. So you might have some ginger in your herb garden. I know with the mint leaves, they would actually take the mint leaves to help kind of flavor their drinks, just like we do today. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of a walk, because what I want to do is I want to tie in also a little bit of like the religious aspects of how Africans or like the enslaved people actually thought about religion. Again, you might hear a lot of people call Africa like Mother Earth, or going back to the motherland. So it's all about being grounded in where you come from. So when people refer to that, it's like going back to the ancestral lands and being close to the ancestors. A lot of times in some African cultures, or even in the African diaspora, they believe that we come from the earth, and then once we die and our soul goes on, we go right back to the earth. So it's kind of like that circle of life. So with that, it's really interesting, because in terms of Earth Day, you can see how these people had such a connection to the earth itself. Because back then, whether you were enslaved, whether you were a yeoman farmer, or you were just an average farmer trying to make a living, trying to live, you really had to depend on the earth. If you didn't, then you would actually die. Because, like, for instance, like when the enslaved would plant their crops. So here at Marietta, the cash crop was tobacco. Um, so we had tobacco. Other plantations, you might have had rice. You might have had sugar cane, like down in the Caribbean. Down in some of the southern states, you would have had cotton. And so a lot of times, say that you didn't have a good crop that year, you would lose a lot of money because you didn't have that crop. So there again, we are depending on the earth and being able to have good land, good weather, in order to have these crops to grow. So you can make a living, so you can make money, and that way. So back then they would use the tobacco as a form of currency. Just like today we use money, back then they were using tobacco for a form of currency. They did a lot of trading. So if you had a crop here, then you were essentially losing money. So again, back then they depended a lot on the earth. Um, and today we still depend on for the trees and everything, and trying to make sure that we're not littering, and making sure that we take care of the earth as best as we can. So we're going to take a walk down here, and I want to show you guys a little bit about how religion kind of tied more into the earth, and what people thought about that. So behind me, you'll kind of see a cemetery. A lot of times, when you see these cemeteries, that might be like where the family of the plantation owners would bury. But sometimes there are some plantations where you would actually see not only the families that own the plantation, but sometimes they also bury some of the enslaved people. Um, at one particular plantation, um, it was believed that if you were to bury your loved ones under the house, then the spirit of that person would always be with you. And so there's different archaeological digs that they have done to find that, and how you kind of stay with your loved ones. It means that your loved ones are not truly gone. So it's all about being connected to Mother Earth, going back to the motherland. And even I know if you're not familiar with, you might see this on TV or sometimes, that in some African cultures, they might do like a rain dance to bring on the rain, to make sure they would have, you know, good crop. They would pray to their gods or whatever religious entity that they believed in. They would pray to that entity. So they would making sure that they would have a good crop year. So even religion kind of ties into the earth, and you know, you could it ties into Earth Day as well. So it's just different ways that we could actually think about this. And even when it comes to um, some of the livestock, like if you do eat meat, you have chickens and cows and cattle um, and sheep. I know here at Marietta they have sheep. Um, you would actually you could actually use the sheep wool to make wool and make sweaters and to make things like that. So again, sheep come from the earth. We actually use that, use their wool. You can actually, you know, use the sheep for actually meat as well. So you have lamb, you have regular, you have different meats like that come from the sheep. So again, it all ties together because once you know the animal dies, their bones like go back to the earth. I know a lot of times for like cattle, we may use their dung for fertilizer. So you're kind of repurposing that and also with what was it? Oh, today we do composting. Some plantations actually have their own form of compost, but it's like you kind of like reuse that to help grow the garden. So there's just a lot of ways that we kind of reuse or recycle because now we always talk about recycling. They had their own form of recycling, and so it's really interesting to see how today we talk about sustainability, we talk about recycling and turning things like especially plastics into reusable items and trying to like stay green as they say. But even back then they were doing all those things without the science, without the technology behind it. So um, it's really cool to see how they kind of correlate together. And even back then with the enslaved, like I said, that they depending on what kind of livestock you had on the plantation, they would use every type, every part of the body, so you wouldn't let anything go to waste. Same with the Native Americans. So it's kind of like that correlating with the Native Americans. They used every single part of the animal in order to live. They lived off the land. And so did the enslaved. Like they used everything they could from the animals to the plants that they had, and just making sure that there was a even in Native American culture and in enslaved culture, there was this kind of reverence or kind of respect for the earth because they knew that if they didn't respect the earth, then it's almost as if they wouldn't get back. They wouldn't get anything from it. And so they had to give that respect in order to get things in return. Because they knew that that's all they had. Um, and they understood that in order to get a good crop, and so again, that's where the religion comes in. We had that good crop, they would, you know, praise the gods or praise God and making sure that, you know, making sure that Mother Earth knew that they were grateful and thankful for the crops that they had. Um, so here at Marietta, you had corn, you had sheep, you had tobacco. So all these things kind of tied into the earth as well. And so sometimes you did have a bad year, like I said before, and you would lose money. But so what I want to do now is that we're going to go to the kitchen and we're going to talk more about how things kind of correlated from um, the kitchen back in, you know, during the enslaved times, during the 18th, 19th centuries, and how it kind of correlates to today, and how we still use things from that time period, and how we use things today to kind of the same. Like a lot of things, there are some things that have changed because of, you know, technology or different laws that they put in place. But a lot of things we do, a lot of the traditions that are passed down, especially in the Black American culture, like even in Black American culture today, we have this reverence and respect for Mother Earth, for the earth, because we understand that there are a lot of things that we get from the earth. And so I think a lot of people have lost touch with that. When you see some of the oceans that have all the trash in them, but overall in the black community, in the black culture, there are things that we still honor in Mother Earth. So we're going to take the time to go downstairs, and then we'll start from there. So welcome back. We are in the kitchen. Now, this doesn't look like most kitchens that we're used to. However, there are a lot of similarities, and again, bringing that connection to, Earth Day and how being enslaved. So usually, it might have been different on different plantations, but on some plantations, you would have, mostly it would be an enslaved woman who was the cook. Now, the cook was considered skilled labor, because you had to, since they weren't allowed to read and weren't supposed to be able to read, a lot of their recipes or the receipts, they had to memorize those recipes. So say that the lady of the house would say, hey, I want this type of food today, or I want this recipe. Because they weren't allowed to read, they would have to, the lady of the house would list off, the ingredients, how to do it. So they had to kind of memorize everything in their heads. So a lot of times, so some of the things that I have on the table, again, come from the earth. So you have things like apples, if you have an apple tree, you have a bowl of eggs here that come from, chickens. And so usually today when we go to a grocery store, you go to the grocery store, you go to the meat section, you can get meat, you can get your ribs, you can get your chicken, you can get your fish. But it didn't just appear on the shelves, right? So there's a whole process that happens before it even gets on the shelves of your grocery store. And back then, they didn't have that. So you would see the process from start to finish, from the time that you butchered the livestock all the way to the end where the food gets up on your table. And so when I say that people would use all of the animal, then that's what I mean. Like, for example, in the enslaved culture, when they would butcher the hogs, for example, they would use every part of the hog. Some of the older generation might even have heard of this. You might have brains and eggs for breakfast. Like, that was the thing. Like, you can still go to the store and get like a little can of pig brains. I've seen that at the store. And so you could cook the brain. They would actually cook the heart. They would cook all of the meat. So when they would butcher the hog, they would use all the meats. They would grind the meat, make into sausage. They would take clean out the intestines, and you could use that for casings. And what the plantation owners would do, they would let the enslaved people have what's called the offal. Basically, the offal was anything that wasn't like the meat. So the brain, the heart, the liver, the lungs, they would actually cook with those things. And so you could actually, there's a recipe or receipt for making, so you could saute the heart, and it would be like you eat like a steak. And I have seen that done in real life, and it does actually look like a steak. But because I knew it wasn't a steak, I did not try it. So I would not eat that. But that was some of they would get like kind of awful, they get the scraps, like what we would call scraps today. You would also use the lard or pig's fat. A lot of times, I know that even like my grandmother, my great grandmother, they would actually cook with lard. So you might have some people that still cook with lard today. So basically, it's like you use it. You can replace lard with butter. So any kind of recipe that calls for butter, you could use lard. I have cooked with lard before, and I would make a pie. I would make the crust from scratch, and the lard, even though it was not as healthy, it made the crust a lot fluffier, and it was so good. Now you have to think about the enslaved diet. Because again, this is all coming from the earth. They are not going to the grocery store. Everything that they would eat with, or anything that they would eat, had to come from the earth in some shape or form, whether it was from a animal like a livestock, or it came from different plants. So um, one of the things that they would do is that they would actually take the they needed in their diet, they needed a high fat diet. Because imagine if you were an enslaved person, you would literally be working from sun up to sundown. Today, a lot of our jobs are sedentary. Some jobs are a lot of like, back breaking labor, but most jobs, we are a very sedentary lifestyle today. So we don't require that high fat diet like they did back then. So a lot of their diets was high fat. So lard was, it was a staple. So they would actually take the lard from the pigs, they would gather it up, put it in a jug, and they would actually put it in they would put it in the kitchen. So you might see like a jug or something on top of the what do you call it, like the top of the hearth, and that would be where they kept the lard. And so other things that you would use from the hog would be you use anything to make sausage, so you have a sausage grinder to make sausage. And they would actually, people back then, even today, people would eat pig's feet. So people eat pig's feet, you can go get the store, get a jar of pigs and pig's feet. Other things that they would actually do is, of course, with cattle, not only did they use the cattle for food, but they also used the cattle to help in labor. So again, using the earth as much as you could. Back then, the enslaved people, the yeoman farmers, they had to use everything that came from the earth. Because again, you couldn't go to a hardware store and buy the tools that you needed. They would actually use, when you use like donkeys or horses to plow the fields. Again, that's coming from the earth. The yoke that they would use to kind of put the cattle or the horses together to help plow the field, that was made of wood. And again, so wood comes from trees, comes from the earth. So they depended a lot on the earth, and really would just use anything around them. They had to be creative and just use what was around them. So here in the kitchen, you kind of had to do the same thing. If you notice, a lot of things in the kitchen here are made out of wood. It comes from the trees. They would actually use the hearth, and it was interesting. It's interesting how they would create fire. Again, fire is one of the elements of the earth. And so the way that they would actually make fire is that they would use stones to help, that use that friction to start a fire. And so, like I said, everything they did was coming from the earth. So, so here you have like the Dutch oven, and now with the Dutch oven, in order to heat that, you had to use the fire. So once you would build that fire, you would build it up to a point where, okay, you were satisfied with the fire, but then you would actually use, again, wood to help keep the fire going. So back then, they relied a lot on the earth. And so, but today we have technology. Like for instance, we have matches, which is a form of technology, because it wasn't anything that doesn't strictly come from the earth. A lot of it is, considered advanced technology. So you have matches, you have lighters now that we can use to start a fire. You can go to a grocery store to get your food now. So being, so I would even say that enslaved people back in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, before the 20th century, people were very reliant on the earth because it's all they had. Even with, making some of the clothes that they had, like I talked about before, they would use sheep. You could also, they would use the sheep to, make the wool. Also, in some places they would have cotton, so you can make clothes out of cotton. And you might notice that, well, they had different colors in their clothes. Like today, I'm wearing a very colorful shirt. It's not that chic. But back then, how did they color their clothes back then? Again, it came from the earth. Some of the way that they would dye their clothes came from plants. For example, in order to get like the blue, like purplish, um, purplish like indigo color, you would need to use there's a bug called a cochlear. So it's a type of bug, and when you take the pestle, you take it and you will squish it into this color, and then you put the color, you put the dye or the powder, once you crush it up with the wool or the cotton, whatever you're trying to dye, in the pot, and then once it boiled, it would stain the wool, and then you would have this beautiful, vibrant color of purple or blue, depending on what type of pot you actually did the boiling in. So if you use a copper pot versus a cast iron, you would get a totally different color. So again, that is using things from the earth. So when you think about it, with the enslaved, they had to be creative, they had to be resourceful, they had to be smart, they had to be very cognitive of how they were using the earth and just finding different things around them that would help them to survive. So from dyeing clothes to cooking meals. I mean, today, if you want to go get eggs, you just go to the store. Back then, you had chickens, you had a chicken coop. So you had chickens that, again, you would use for meat, but you would also use them for their eggs. And so when you're cooking something and you just need some eggs, you would send someone out to chicken coop to collect the eggs. So it's just really, it just tells you when you look at it how the enslaved people really were connected to the land and to the earth and really just use their resources. And nowadays, we don't really have to do that as much because of the advancement of technology. And even today, but I think today people are trying to go back to that because you have like stores like Whole Foods and Sprouts and these other fresh markets and farmers markets all over the place that are trying to get back to being organic and using and people being more cognitive of what kind of skin products they're using when it comes to chemicals and making sure they're using like organic stuff. But it's interesting because it's almost as if as a society we're trying to go back to our roots. And so a lot of things, and I always like to say this when it comes to the enslaved community, the enslaved culture, the enslaved community really kind of helped shape our society today, whether it's some of the foods that we have today, that's part of our American cuisine, whether it's some of the things that we have learned from the enslaved community. But it just kind of shows you how now we're kind of going, how history kind of repeats itself. So now we're trying to get back to, oh, let's be organic. Let's talk about sustainability. Let's use the things that we have around us from the earth. When people back then were already doing that. So now we're trying to go back to what we were doing before because we're seeing, especially through science, we're seeing that is it was more healthy and just trying to figure out how to live longer, find out the ways to be healthier. So that's just a little bit about enslaved and trying and tying it um, to Earth Day.
Trenda, thank you so much. That was so wonderful and so energetic and knowledgeable. Um, I'm going to turn this down. Okay. We do have a couple questions for you here. Was there any evidence of the tools that were made by the enslaved?
I know I'm not sure particularly at Marietta, but I know at some plantations there have been documentations at different other plantations that I worked for where one of the labor skills that enslaved people could have was that of the blacksmith. And so the blacksmith would be the one who would make all the tools like the nails, all the tools, that they were using.
And then another question is clothes that required needlework to wear them. Did each family pass that down by the enslaved? And Alexia, I'm not sure exactly, you might need to ask the question yourself. Are you asking if the clothes were passed down or if the skill of needlework was passed down?
The skill, like the skill of it. Was it like an elderly person that would pass it down, like when a child was like 5 or 6? Like, how did that work?
Yeah, a lot of times that would be like a skill that was passed down, kind of like with any other of the skills. Like you would have the seamstress, so a lot of times the seamstress would have an apprentice, is like with the cook. So a lot of that stuff was actually passed down. And then once they would learn, and again they would pass it down to their children.
Okay, thank you.
I think you're on mute, Stacy.
And Trenda, that is so fascinating that the pot made a difference too, and how you were dyeing the clothes, how the clothes would be dyed.
Yeah, so you kind of have like a little bit of science in there as well.
That's so cool. And now when and for all those listening, Trenda does a number of reenactments with the cooking. And what is one of the dishes that you find the hardest to make?
One of the hardest dishes that I had to make was, well, it was actually for our hog butchering day when I worked at Historic Brattonsville. I actually had to boil a pig's head, and that was kind of the hardest thing because it took hours. And like it took me like a course of like 2 days. But another dish that was kind of hard to make was it's a what do you call it, like it's like kind of like a candy, so it's like, think of like peanut brittle, but it was actually like peanuts and molasses, so it was like a treat that the enslaved would make. And the reason why that was kind of difficult was because if you didn't have the temperature of the fire just right, you would end up burning the like the molasses. So you had to kind of time it just right.
Well, and that's hard to do too on when you're burning by when you're doing the fire without the oven that stays at a particular degree.
Yeah.
Oh, that is really cool. So does anyone have any other questions for Trenda? Well, Trenda, thank you so much. What a terrific presentation. Truly appreciate it, and your knowledge, and thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
So thank you all so much for joining us. We truly appreciate it and appreciate you being here. Happy Earth Day to everyone. And remember to please take care of Mother Earth. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.